So it seems like we've been going through the parables lately. And I don't know about you, but I kind of love the parables. I'm a teacher myself, and to me, the parables say something really interesting about how Jesus taught. Jesus didn't say, okay, here's the facts. I'm going to tell you exactly what you need to know. Write it down and memorize it because there's going to be a quiz on Friday. He doesn't do that at all. Instead, he says, listen, I'm going to tell you a story. And then he tells all these little stories about everyday things, like a man who goes out to plant crops, or a woman searching for a lost coin, or a son who runs away from home. But the stories are never as simple as they look. And his listeners have to puzzle over them. They have to try to make sense of them. And sometimes the stories seem pretty straightforward, but often we're a little confused. But I think that's okay. I think that Jesus told us these stories not to give us the one right answer, but because they give us so much to puzzle over. We can read them in different ways. We can change our minds about what they mean. So, this week, we hear about weeds and wheat sown together in a field. They grow together, but when the harvest comes, they're finally separated, and the wheat is put safely in a barn, but the weeds are gathered up in bundles and burned. And I actually remember hearing this parable as a child. And the reason I remember it is because it scared me so much. I assumed that the wheat and the weeds were two groups of people, one destined for heaven and the other destined for hell. And I didn't know where I fit in. Was I good enough to be counted among the wheat? How could I tell? And one reason I think that I found this parable so scary is that in it, good and evil seem to be innate characteristics. It doesn't seem to allow any room for change. Even as a child, I knew that one kind of plant can never turn into another. So I think I was actually looking at it from the weeds perspective. They didn't decide to be weeds, they just were. They couldn't help it. And if they got tired of being weeds, well, too bad. They can't change themselves into wheat. They're just stuck being what they are, and then they get destroyed for it. And I remember sitting there as a child, afraid that I might be a weedy kind of person. And if that was so, well, there's not a lot of hope in this parable. But the thing about the parables is that you do have to keep thinking about them. You have to ask, what's the metaphor? What's going on? How does this make sense? And when you think you have something figured out, you have to ask, the way that I'm making sense of this, is this consistent with who Jesus is? Does this line up with what we know of God? I mean, a moment's thought will tell us that not every comparison that comes to mind holds up. I mean, if you hear, the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, and you say, seeds are small, but they can grow and flourish, you might be onto something. But if you say, oh, I know what mustard seeds are like, the kingdom of heaven must be round and very, very tiny. Well, you'd probably be missing the point of the comparison. So rereading this parable now, I think I may have missed the point as a child. I don't think that Jesus's point is that there are good people and bad people and they can never change. That doesn't seem to line up with anything that Jesus says in the rest of the Gospels. If people can't change, why would Jesus spend so much time teaching? Why would he keep saying, repent and turn around and forgive one another and come, follow me? So maybe the parable isn't as simple as I once thought. Maybe Jesus isn't dividing the world into good people and bad people. I think instead that Jesus in this parable begins by just describing the facts about the world that we live in. Just like the field has weeds and wheat and they seem hopelessly intertwined, we look at the world and everywhere we look, we see that good and evil are intertwined. Wherever we look, we can see love and hatred, kindness and cruelty, truth and lies. And if we're honest, we know that it isn't just the world out there that's mixed like that. If we look inside ourselves, we find that same mixture in our own hearts. Perhaps we look inside ourselves and we see generosity and kindness, or faith and loyalty. But maybe we also know that we give in to anger or greed or contempt. So maybe Jesus is saying, you see this field with weeds and wheat? They grow together and they affect each other. That's the reality of the world, and it's also the reality of human hearts. So what's the owner of the field going to do about it in this parable? Well, the presence of evil clearly wasn't part of his plan. The story makes it clear that he only sowed good seed. It was an enemy who sowed weeds in the field, and now the weeds and the wheat are coming up together. So what does the landowner do? Well, he waits. And I wonder if Jesus's listeners would have found this very strange, because that's not what normal gardeners do. Normal gardeners see a weed and pull it out, but this one waits. So maybe part of this parable is about God's patience. God is patient in a way that we are not. We often see evil, or think we see evil, and want to leap in and condemn it. And not just condemn the evil in the abstract, but condemn the people we think are doing wrong. So if we had the power, we'd be out in that field yanking up the weeds. But when the landowner's slaves ask if they should rip out the weeds, he says, no, I want you to wait. Because if you're in too big a hurry to rip out the weeds, you might rip out the good wheat also. God waits because God takes the long view. God knows what plants are like. He made them. So he knows that weeds don't turn into wheat. But he made human beings too. And he knows that human beings can and do change. God continues to pour love into the world. And God knows that sometimes we do change. We do repent. Sometimes evil is rejected and we turn to God and grow in holiness. That mistake that you keep making, you may overcome it yet. That person you've decided is a terrible sinner, he or she may yet become a great saint. And maybe part of this parable is about our limitations. We are often all too eager to point out the weediness in other people's lives. Yank it out, we say. But how often are we fooling ourselves? How often are we blind to the weeds in our own hearts? So now, I think this parable is partly about God's patience and partly about our limitations. And I think that's actually kind of freeing. If I look for myself in this parable, I'm not the landowner who sows the seed and makes the final judgments. That's pretty clearly God. I'm not even one of the slaves who goes out to reap the harvest. Jesus says that's the angels. I'm just one of the plants in the field. But that isn't as passive a role as you might think, because plants actually aren't passive at all. When wheat does what it was created to do, it takes nourishment from the soil, and it reaches for the light, and it grows and produces grain. And that metaphor works for us too. Jesus makes it pretty clear what his followers are to do: to love our neighbors as ourselves, to care for those in need, to seek justice. When we do that, we yield a harvest. In one case, 100-fold, in another 60, and in another 30. We're not to throw up our hands and say, oh, evil doesn't matter, or there's nothing we can do. But we are to realize what is our responsibility and what isn't. It's our responsibility to grow and to struggle in the midst of the weeds. But it's not ultimately our responsibility to judge, to declare that another person should be counted among the weeds, or to hope for their destruction. Instead, we struggle first against the weeds in ourselves, our anger, our greed, our hatred. And as we do that, we can also struggle against the evils we see in the world. But we cannot do it with hate or with judgment against others. As we struggle, we must remember that we are not the ones ultimately responsible for judgment. It is God who provides the field that we all grow in. God who provides the sun and the soil and the water, and God who patiently waits, certain that despite the weeds, the wheat will persevere and thrive. Despite the weeds in our life and in our world, may we trust and believe that God is working with us and through us to produce a bountiful harvest.